Well, good morning, church. Welcome to Connection Point. Man, it's such an honor to be here with you guys this morning. My name is Josh Mosteller, and I had the privilege of hanging out with your students this weekend at Weekend 2023. And to say the least, it was an amazing weekend where we saw God do the unimaginable. And when God works, it is always miraculous. When God saves, it is always undeserved. And so what a pleasure it was to be a part of this student ministry this weekend. I want to start off by saying, man, what a privilege it was to serve alongside Pastor Stephen this weekend in the student ministry. And I want to say, if y'all don't know this, which you should know by now, Pastor Stephen is such a blessing to your church. And Pastor Stephen has a love for the gospel and a love for students that is unmatched, and it's a blessing to watch as God uses him to love these students, to help them in advance in their journey to Christ. And if you're in the room and you're a student who's not connected to the student ministry yet, as an outside student pastor, let me encourage you. You need to connect to what God is doing at Connection Point students, because I believe there's something special that God wants to do in your life through this student ministry. Well, hey, I mentioned my name is Josh, and I have the privilege of being a pastor at Battle Creek Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I grew up in the great state of North Carolina, right outside of Charlotte, and so I am a Carolina Panthers fan. I love the Carolina Panthers, and I understand, and I have heard that I am in the city of champions this weekend. Man. And I totally understand that while y'all were the Super Bowl champions, we were the toilet bowl champions. And so we get to draft ninth and hopefully figure this thing out with the new coach this year. But we are from Charlotte. My family is on the screen behind me. We have two daughters. Our oldest daughter is Allie Kate, and our youngest is Maggie. And in like 3.5 weeks, you can ask us how we're doing, because we're having another little girl in 3.5 weeks. And so we'll have a 3.5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a newborn. And so our house is about to be crazy. A lot of people like to say, Josh, you're going to be outnumbered. And my wife likes to remind me and everyone else that it's actually her that's outnumbered, because they're daddy's girls, and we kind of gang up on her at home. And so this morning, I have the privilege of kind of finishing off this weekend, but also stepping into a series you've been walking through called Who's Your One? I mean, what an awesome concept Who's Your One is, right? Like, who's that one person that's in your life that you have influence over? And throughout this weekend, we've talked about this theme of called being in ruin. We started off night one talking about the ruin of sin. We talked about how sin is living, believing a lie. And ultimately, when we're in the ruin of sin, it separates us from the God who created us for a relationship with him. Yesterday morning, we dove into this idea of the ruin of religion and how God has not called us to a religion. He has called us to a relationship. He has not called us to sit on the sideline and wait to die, but he has called us to live on mission and not just pursue a religious activity. And then last night, we ended up talking about the ruin of Jesus, how when he enters our life, he changes everything. And ultimately, the call of following Jesus is to come and die, but in that calling, we find what true life is in Jesus Christ. And so today we're going to look at what do we do when we understand this concept. We understand that Jesus came, he lived a perfect life, he died on the cross for your sins. When we have accepted that free gift of salvation, when we are living our life in relationship with Jesus, what do we do with that? And so this morning, we're going to look at a familiar story in Daniel chapter 3. So you can go ahead and flip open to your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3 this morning. But I want to share some statistics with you before we get going about this generation. You may be shocked, like I am, to come to the understanding that Gen Z is considered the first post-Christian generation. If you're like me, you might be like, okay, so what does that mean? That's a big term. And post-Christian simply means that Christianity is no longer the dominant civil religion of a society, but has gradually assumed the values, the culture, and worldviews that are not based in Christianity. In fact, if you look at the statistics, only 42% of this generation believe in Jesus Christ. And the same statistic is true of those who would claim that they do not. While 42% of Gen Z believe in Jesus, 42% do not. And the other few percent, they're just a little confused on what's true and what's not. The other staggering statistic that blows my mind every time is in the generations above Gen Z. We would call those adults. 6% of adults would claim to be atheist. But in Gen Z, 13% of that generation claim to be atheist. So what that means is double the percentage of Gen Z claim to be atheist than every generation that came before them. And so these statistics are staggering, and we see things like Asbury, and God is on the move, and God is still in this business of salvation where he wants to save lost sinners by the power of the gospel. Amen. And I'm believing that he wants to use you and me to do that. He wants us to be a part of his mission. And so we're going to look at this story of these three guys called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And starting off in the book of Daniel, we see this guy named Nebuchadnezzar. And I like to think that if Nebuchadnezzar had a rapper name or an easier name to say, he might be called Lil Nebby, or just Nebby for sure. And so for my purpose, we're going to refer to him as Nebby. And so Nebby walks into Babylon, he kicks the door open, and he says, yo, I'm here and I'm in charge. And so he starts to make some crazy decisions. And one of the first things we see early on in this story is Nebby says, hey, all of you important guys, all his governors and officials, he says, I want you to go find the best looking and smartest guys in the whole nation, and I want you to bring them to me. And so at first, I just want to say I'm kind of offended by Nebby's stipulations because my dad bod and my 22 ACT score would not have met his standards of the smartest and best people. And so Nebby says, go get them. And he finds in all of these people, these guys named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he says, hey, you're going to eat this way, you're going to talk this way, I'm going to train you for 3 years, and you're going to be the best of the best. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego early on in their journey with Nebby say, hey, you know what? God has called us to holiness. I'm not going to stain myself with unholiness. I'm going to pursue what God has called me to do. So they said, hey, let us eat our own diet. Let us do our own thing and come back and check us, and I promise we'll be better than everyone else because we are following what God commands us to follow. So a few days later, Nebby comes back and realizes that not only are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego smarter and stronger than everyone else, but they are 10 times that. And so Nebby has a history with these guys, right? He has a relationship. This is not just a random king talking to three guys that he has no history with. And so we pick up when King Nebby kind of gets a little crazy. He starts to make some wild decisions, and we pick up in verse 1, and it says, Nebby made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebby sent all of his officials to come together and get the people to dedicate the image of King Nebby that he had set up. First of all, I just want to recognize this statue is like massive. 60 cubits is about 6 stories tall. And so like imagine you're driving downtown Kansas City and like there's a statue of Patrick Mahomes that's gold and 6 stories high. This is like what King Nebby does. He says, hey, worship this statue. And we go on and we see that King Nebby, he then says, hey, you are commanded, all peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of all of these instruments, I like to think it's like a marching band, but there's a lot of instruments. He said, when you hear the sound of these instruments, you're going to fall down and worship the golden image that I have set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning furnace. And so then all the instruments play and people bow down and they worship King Nebby, except for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so his cronies, the important people, the officials and the satraps and all these guys, they're kind of like the tattletales in the class, or they're like the people who no one really likes because they just try to hold everyone to a standard that they're not meeting. And so these guys, they go to King Nebby and they said, hey, King Nebby, these guys, they're not doing what you said they should do. So King Nebby gets a little mad, right? He gets a little frustrated. And he calls them in and he says, hey, like, why are you not doing this? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in verse 16 answered and said to the king, oh, Nebby, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. We will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. I want to point out in these few verses that these men didn't attack King Nebi. They didn't judge him for being lost, because lost people act lost. And so we can't expect them to act saved. So they're not like shocked that he builds this statue and says, worship me, because we're to expect that out of people who don't know Jesus. And so King Nebi, at this point, like I imagine he's like the guy in the cartoons who has fire coming out of his head, and he's just furious. So he takes these three guys, and what the story says is that they take them and they bind them with rope and they cast them into the furnace. And when they open the doors to the furnace, the guards who threw them in there were dead upon contact because it was so hot. And we pick up and we see King Nebi's kind of confused at this point. His guards had died because it was so hot. He threw these three men into the fire, and we see that King Nebi says this. He was astonished. He rose up in haste, and he declared to all of these counselors, did we not cast three men into the fire? They answered and said, King, that's true. He said, but I see four men walking in the midst of the fire, and they're not hurt, and the appearance of the fourth is like the Son of God's. What? This is like crazy. King Nebi throws three guys in, and now there's four, and they're just walking around having like a tea party in the fire. And King Nebi's like, what in the world is going on? And so King Nebi comes near the door. He declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out here and come here. They came out of the fire, and all the officials gathered together and saw that the fire had no power to the bodies of these men. The hair on their heads were not singed, their cloaks were not harmed. No smell of fire came upon them. Then Nebuchadnezzar, to end this story, makes a decree that anyone who does not worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be destroyed. This is a pretty drastic shift in the culture, wouldn't you say? Like, they throw them into the fire. And first of all, like, I hate bonfires because I go home and can't get it out of, like, my skin for days. I smell like fire. But these guys, they're, like, in a fiery furnace and have no smell. They're not singed, and they have no evidence of having ever been in there. And King Nebi's stunned, and then he makes this decree, hey, their God is so powerful. Anyone who does not worship that God is not worshiping the true God. And so the main idea, if you're like me and you maybe have ADD, and you're like, I just need like one thing to grasp onto every Sunday, this is for you. The main idea of all of this is as follows. We must move from being influenced to being an influencer for Christ. We must move from being influenced to being an influencer for Christ. You see, every single person, no matter how young or how old you are in this room, you have potential to influence the people in your lives. You have the potential to make a positive difference where they can connect and grow closer to God. But you see, the outcome of your influence only depends on how you utilize it. I want to encourage us this morning that there's no one too young or too old to influence people for Jesus. There's no retirement date for influencing people for Jesus. God has called us to use our influence for His purpose and His glory for the entirety of our lives. And so I want to point out two things these guys did really good. In this whole crazy story, there's two things, and none of these things are going to be like, wow, Josh, you used a theology degree to come to that conclusion. They're pretty straightforward this morning for us. And the first thing we see they did is they resisted the temptation to conform. They resisted it. You see, to conform means to follow the up-to-date social standards. It means to follow the crowd. It means to follow what the culture would say is normal. And we're called to resist the cultural norms. We're called to resist what the culture defines as living our best life. But I want to clarify, what I don't mean by resist is voting a certain way, speaking out about your political or social agenda, telling lost people that their lifestyle is wrong, making a declaration of your opinion on Facebook. That's not resisting. That's just making people angry. You see, these men, they didn't go into Nebi's office and turn his desk over and say, hey, you're living wrong, you're going to hell. They just said, God has called us to more than this. And so we will not conform to what you've asked us to do. And that's what we're called to do, church. We're called to resist the culture that tells us that the way Jesus calls us to live is not normal. In fact, they would even maybe say that Jesus ruins our life because he calls us to sacrifice. You see, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they understood this. Some examples of conforming in this day and age might be wearing certain clothing, skipping church when your friends do, or going out of a place you shouldn't with your work friends after work one night just so they approve of you, or taking that joke just a little bit too far at work just so that those peers in your cubicle will think that you're like them and that they can hang out and you're a good hang. But I was driving here this morning, and as this message was on my heart about resisting conforming to the culture, I couldn't help but take notice of this place on my way here. It's called the Unity Chapel, and my wife and I all weekend, we've been like, what is this place? Like, it looks beautiful. It looks like some kind of church, and so we began to research, and what they would define themselves as a New Age Christianity. And they're accepting of all people, and hear me say, church, we must love all people. We are called to love all people the way Jesus does, but we're not called to conform to their version of this world. And so as I was driving here, I couldn't help but take notice that, like, the epitome of conforming is saying, hey, we are going to accept all people from all walks of life, and we're all going to worship together because there's really no truth and there's no God, and we're just going to accept you even though you don't understand the truth. That's not what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. And you see, conforming to the culture will always lead us to spiritual apathy. It will always lead us to live a life that is less than Jesus called us to. It will always lead to confusion in the people around us. You see, the cool thing about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is they kind of made a bold statement when Nebi was upset. They said, hey, we have no need to answer you in this matter. They were secure in what they believed. They were secure in their faith in God. And they said, hey, no matter what you say, we're not changing what God has created us to do. We're not conforming to the pressure that you're calling us to. We have no need to answer you. You see, if these guys did not find their security and safety in God, then they would have conformed. But they were willing to be saved or sacrificed for the sake of God's glory. I referenced earlier, we have two beautiful daughters. In fact, they're 14 months apart, and they almost look like twins. And their personalities are not like twins. In fact, our younger daughter, if you've ever seen these TikTok videos or a video on Facebook, like the videos of the sweet little girl dressed in a princess dress, and then like the younger one driving like a Matchbox car in the yard with like candy all over her face and sunglasses on, like that's the epitome of our daughters. Like polar opposites. But one thing they have in common is that they like to play with the same toys, and they like to do the same things. And so the other day, my wife's graciously making dinner at like 37 gazillion weeks pregnant, and she says, hey girls, it's time for dinner, come grab your seat. And all she hears is Allie Kate, our oldest, whispering, hey Maggie, tell mommy no. Like, what? You know, like, she is encouraging her sister to disobey and disrespect her mom. And what does Maggie do? She says, no, mama. You know, like she doesn't know any different. She doesn't know any better. But she's conforming to what Allie Kate wants her to do just so Allie Kate doesn't get the punishment for saying no. What Allie Kate doesn't know is that she whispers like a lion just like her dad. I tell you that story to say is like, church, sometimes the culture is going to whisper lies in your ear. They're going to tell you that something's normal that God calls dishonoring and disgraceful, that God calls sin. And if we choose to believe those lies, then ultimately we are choosing to disobey the God who created us. We're choosing to conform to much less than God has called us to. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they resisted conforming. These men said no to the king's way because they wanted to say yes to God's way. And please understand, this was risky business, y'all. Saying no to a king was basically saying yes to death. It was saying yes to punishment. It was saying yes to the fire. But these men, they didn't care whether they were saved by, through, or in the fire. They were going to serve the God who created them. You see, the culture wanted them to look a certain way, talk a certain way, live a certain way, but they rejected that pressure to conform to the culture's standards. And church, I'm not ignorant enough to believe that you're not feeling that pressure every day. You feel pressure every day to conform, to work hard and make more money, to live a good life, to believe that sexuality is fluid, that it's okay to be all about you and live a selfish life if it means you're living your best life. The culture wants you to believe the pressure that we have to succeed at all costs. And to be honest with you, success, working hard, having money, living a happy life are not bad things. But oftentimes the culture wants us to make these good things a God thing. And when a good thing becomes a God thing, it is a bad thing. You see, God has called you to much more than happiness and success and joy on earth. He has called you to sacrifice everything for the sake of knowing Christ and Him crucified. And the culture will tell you that that's abnormal. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they resisted conforming. You see, saying no to the culture does not always mean you're saying yes to God. Sometimes it means you're just saying yes to your agenda. But saying yes to God will always mean saying no to the culture. Every time. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the second thing we see they did is that they influenced people for God's glory. They influenced people for Jesus. If you look back to verses 28 through 30, it's a drastic change in the spiritual culture of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar drastically shifts, and I want to say like he might have some emotional problems he needs counseling with. He's kind of just all over the map. But Nebi said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted him, and set aside the king's commands and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their house laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Y'all, these men literally changed the spiritual pulse of the culture they lived in just by living in obedience to God. That's all it took. They didn't post on Facebook or make a fool of themselves. They just made much of God. And they influenced the whole culture and changed the whole culture's perspective. You see, their impact went way beyond King Nebi. It led to the entire culture being impacted to serve the one true God. But church, here's the reality for believers in Jesus Christ. We have to know our purpose to influence people. And your purpose is clearly defined in Matthew 28:19. It says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey my words." That is your purpose as a believer in Jesus Christ, is to make much of Jesus to a lost world. To go, and here's the reality, as a lot of church people view this as a suggestion. And let me tell you that this is not the great suggestion, this is the great commission. Jesus commands us to go. He doesn't give us an option. If we're believers, we will go. If we're believers, we will make much of Jesus in a lost world. And can I just confess to you that this is really, really hard? I fail at this a lot. My wife can tell you tons of stories, but I'm choosing to just share one this morning. A few years ago on Christmas morning, in church world, you work Christmas Eve and you fly home Christmas morning to be with family. And so about 6:30, we show up at the Tulsa International Airport. It is the smallest airport, but some of the toughest people to deal with, I'm telling you. So we walk into the airport, we get to the desk, and y'all, we bought this limousine stroller. It was amazing. It has leather handlebars. It does a full 360. If you're a parent in the room and you don't have this limousine stroller, get it, okay? It's a lifesaver. So I pull up with my limousine stroller to the desk, and I'm like, yes, it's gonna be so easy. There's all kinds of places to store bags. We can attach stuff to this thing. And I get to the desk, and the lady looks at me and says, "Hey, sir, we're gonna have to weigh your stroller." I said, "What? Weigh it? Why?" I said, "I already weighed it. It weighs good, right?" And so I began to take all the seats off, take all the bags out of this stroller, and try to make it weigh the number I don't even know it's supposed to weigh. And so I put it on the scale, and I even like put it halfway on the scale, so like maybe we'll get through. And it weighed 32 pounds, and the weight it has to weigh is 25. And I was wearing my Love God, Love People shirt with Battle Creek Church all over it. And I stand up to that desk and I say, lady, do you not understand that I have 2 kids and a wife? Do you not understand how hard this is gonna be for me? And can I just be honest with you, I made a fool of myself in that moment. I was not reflecting Christ to a lost world. In fact, I was wearing a Jesus shirt, but poorly representing him. And so, long story short, I'm like, okay, take the stroller. We'll just figure this out. So I'm walking up to the TSA, and we get to the TSA agent, and he's like, sir, there's no infant on your boarding pass. I was like, what do you mean there's no infant on our boarding pass? He's like, yeah, you're going to have to go back down to the American Airlines desk and get this added. And I was like, are you kidding me? This lady I was just so rude to, like, there's no way she's going to want to help me. And so I walk down, and I'm like in line praying, Lord, please give us a different agent. Lord, please give us someone different. And so I walk up there with my daughter, Maggie. She's like 6 or 7 months old at this time. And I say, hey, ma'am, first of all, I drew the lady I didn't want to draw. But I said, I'm really sorry for how I treated you. I said, I believe in Jesus Christ, and I believe I'm supposed to reflect him to you, and I did that very poorly. I said, but I really need your help. She was like, sir, I will help you. So she puts Maggie on the boarding pass, and I'm like, praise the Lord. Like, you humbled me, Lord. I understand that. I'm not living in this moment like you called me to live, and I got the point. So I'm walking up the escalator with Maggie in my hands, and I trip and fall face first on the escalator. And this lady's just down there. She's just cracking up. And I'm like, all right, Lord, like, I get it. I still have scars on my shins, y'all. Like, it's still there. It's evidence of humility that God's called me to, right? And so I say all that to say is reflecting Christ to a lost world sometimes is hard because it requires us to be selfless when we want to be selfish. It requires us to elevate others over self. It requires us to be told no even when we want a yes. It requires us to make much of him and less of us. And y'all, it's so hard. So I say all that to say is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they give us a good example. And in that moment at the airport, I realized that the level in which I influence people around me is only limited by my desire to do that. It's only limited by my desire to actually live the life God has called me to live. And truthfully, there's a lot of excuses we can make. Maybe a few of them are as follows. What if I don't know all the answers they have about Jesus? What if this relationship that I have built for the sake of reflecting Christ to this person, like what if they want to break that friendship off? Or maybe, what if I get fired from my job for reflecting Christ in my workplace? These are all valid fears. These are all things that we think on a regular basis, but let me encourage you that all of these things are rooted in my inadequacy when all we have to do is trust God has equipped us for the work of the ministry. What Jesus has called you to, he will sustain you through. In fact, in John 14, Jesus tells us this, truly, truly, I say to you, he who believes in me, the works that I do, he will also do. And greater works than these he will do. Because I go to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, that will I do, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you ask anything in my name, I will do it. Jesus tells us that we have the potential to make a large difference on the face of this earth. He says, the works I have done, you can do those things, and greater works than those. What he's saying is you have the potential in your lifespan to make a large numerical difference in the number of people who are lost and on their way to hell. Jesus has empowered you to influence a lost culture. He has equipped you with everything you need. And for us as believers, it's time to get off the sideline and get in the starting lineup. You see, you might say, Josh, okay, what do I do? What's my application steps? Well, what do I do today? And I'll have 3 very quick, very easy things for you this morning. And the band's gonna come forward so we can celebrate out of this moment. But for you, I want you to write these 3 steps down you can begin taking today. Number 1, be content with being different. Be content with being different. Jesus has called you to be different than the culture you live in. You see, a lot of lost people are tripping over Christians on the way to church because they look no different than the world they live in. Believers have to stop making excuses to live like the lost world that they're in. Be content with being different. Step 2, step out of your group. Step out of the people that you are commonly with. Step out of that friend group. Go to a new barbershop. Go to a new Walmart line. Go to a new area at work where you might bump into someone new that needs to know Jesus. Step out of your group. If all we do as a church is huddle in Christian huddles, we will not reflect Christ to a lost world. And the last step for us this morning is live a life that is noticeably different to those around us. You're not called to judge the world. You're called to reflect Christ to it. You see, people should not know you follow Jesus just by the words you say. They should know that you follow Jesus by the life you live, by the glory you give to him. We cannot claim that Jesus changes everything but live like he changes nothing. Jesus has called you to great things for his glory. Church, you have all that you need to influence the culture in the greater Kansas City area. God will empower you to do what he has called you to do. Our calling is to reflect Christ to a lost world. Let's stand and proclaim that truth this morning.